Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and this is our lecture for Chapter 7 in the SAC book, Maintaining Change in Substance Use Behaviors. I'm just going to warn you that my cat has been very interested in my laptop, and so I'm a little concerned that we might be interrupted because he might jump on the keyboard again. So bear with me. All right. So this chapter builds off of the previous chapters, Chapter 3, motivational interviewing, and then how do we keep clients motivated, and then through the group work as well. So we're getting more into the specifics here than what we saw in Chapter 3, Chapter 5, and Chapter 6. Okay. So specifically, we're going to be looking at relapse and how we help clients through relapse and the different types of relapses. Okay. So our objectives are to create an ethical imperative for relapse prevention approaches to substance use disorder treatment, identify the stages of change a client will encounter when addressing a substance use concern, and we've talked about this extensively throughout the semester already. We're going to define relapse, distinguish a variety of relapse models, recognize relapse risk factors, explain relapse change, and characterize strategies for reducing risk and stopping relapse. Okay. Relapse prevention is often the most highly desired treatment outcome for clients with substance use disorder, and you'll hear from clients with multiple relapse histories, treatment stays, maybe even prison or jail terms as well, that they might have been doing well for a certain period of time, and then everything came crashing down. Okay. Right. Your text says that the goals of the client are theirs to determine, and the ethical counselor acts as a guide and consultant. And this chapter really compares and contrasts the traditional or older way of handling relapse and how we're finding it in an evidence-based way now to work with relapse. Okay. So right out of the book on page 161, for the many clients who have not achieved lasting sobriety after treatment, it's important to know it is not their fault. In fact, most people do not receive evidence-based care, and the treatment they do receive is not likely to result in success. Okay. So usually what in the old model, and if you watch the film The Business of Recovery, which is available on Amazon Prime, and I think that it's a very eye-opening film, the model is, oh, well, you're not doing well outpatient, so we're going to bring you up to intensive outpatient. Oh, you're going 3 times a week and you relapsed? Okay, you'll go 4 times a week. Oh, you're doing 4 times a week and you relapsed? Okay, we'll do 5 times a week then. Oh, you're not doing enough. We're going to go to inpatient. Same thing with 12-step. Well, you're not going to enough meetings. You need to go to more meetings, or it's not working because you're not doing enough. Rather than saying that maybe the person doesn't fit the model rather than the model not fitting the person. And so we really need to evaluate our clients on an individual basis. Okay. Right. Oftentimes clients are going to think that relapse is the end of the world. And it can be a choice with how we frame it for them. You know, we want to frame it as a learning experience. A lapse or a relapse or a slip can be rife with rich information about what was going on to prevent it. So we might say that relapse is part of recovery, and it can be. However, that shouldn't be used as an excuse like, oh, well, I'm due for a relapse, so I'm going to do it. Okay. And some counselors will say that a relapse happens months before a person even picks up the drug, and you might be able to see that with behavioral changes before the person actually does start using again. Okay. With any behavior change, it takes time. There are hiccups. If you think about changing your diet, a lot of people are on the keto diet these days. So like, let's say that keto was our new behavior and you slipped up and you had more carbs than you were supposed to. Would that be a lapse? It might be a relapse if you go right back into your old way of eating if you had been determined to change your behavior. And we know that there are a lot of bumps and wrong turns, and instead of shaming ourselves and just like, oh, well, F it, we're going to go that way, we can make conscious and mindful decisions. So let's look at the definition of relapse. Okay. Right. in the text in page 163, a relapse or an uncontrolled return to alcohol or other drug use following competent treatment is one of the greatest problems substance abusers and their counselors face. Okay. There's 3 different stages of relapse. 1 is a return to non-problematic drinking. 2 is a slip, which is a temporary lapse in control. And 3 is a relapse, which is a return to uncontrolled substance use. Now, since we are in the middle of a paradigm shift, many treatment centers are going to consider non-problematic drinking as something that doesn't exist. We do have to realize that for some people it might work, and for other people it might not work. Okay. And again, no wrong door to treatment. Okay. Also on page 163, we see the stages of change. Your assignment from last week was actually to look at these stages of change. So pre-contemplation, the client has no intention of altering his or her behavior. In the olden days, we might have called this denial. Contemplation is where the client is aware of their problem and they're considering the possibility of action. So they're having a conversation with themselves. In the stage of preparation, the client has begun making small changes and is serious and beginning to be committed about making a change. Action is where they're living that change and they're making that behavior modification. Maintenance/relapse prevention is where the client is working to preserve that successful behavioral modification. Okay. So this might mean that there are some adjustments or they're changing their plans a little bit as life does what life does. Relapse, sometimes it's called termination. Don't quite like that word, but sometimes it is. Relapse is where the client goes back to unhealthy behavior. Stable behavior is where the client has successfully adapted the behavior modification and it's integrated into their life, which is also called long-term success. Okay. So let's go back and look at these definitions because they coincide perfectly with the stages of change. Okay. And remember that the stages of change, even though they're in a list format, and on page 162 they're in a circle format, it's not linear. A person can enter and go in and out of any phase of change, any stage of change. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you an example of a slip. Okay. I once had a client and their primary drug of choice had been methamphetamine. And this client had been granted custody of their children and their partner's child from a previous relationship because they were doing so well and their partner was still in the drug lifestyle and not fit to parent at that time. And the person was CPS involved and they were doing very, very well in their program. And then one day, all of us providers, the social workers, the counselors, the case managers, we received a phone call from them in that on the way home from work, a coworker had given them a ride and had offered them a hit of marijuana, and they smoked part of the joint on the ride home, and they were so terrified that they were going to lose their kids. Now remember that marijuana was not this person's drug of choice, it was methamphetamine. And so they called all of us and said, you know, what happens now? They didn't try to hide it, they were completely transparent about it. And it was a slip or a lapse in control. And we asked them, what do you think led up to this? And they said, well, I hadn't been exercising like I was. I had let my self-help meetings go down. I wasn't taking as good a care of myself. I was preoccupied with kids and work, and I wasn't doing those things that I know that's kept me sober. And they were still able to graduate from the drug court program, and they did a great job, and still has custody of their children, to my knowledge. So that's an example of a slip. Okay, so what this person did was handle it as a learning experience and did not wallow in the shame or guilt or go full back into their drug of choice, but they realized, okay, this is a warning sign. This is what happened. Okay. Now, I've mentioned this before, but the Sinclair method can help people return to non-problematic drinking. And what it is, it's naltrexone, which is used with opiates and alcohol. It's an opiate blocker. And Dr. Sinclair believes that it takes the brain back to a pre-craving, pre-stage of addiction, before the person experienced addiction. So a person that is using the Sinclair method, they would take a pill about an hour before they drink. And what happens is it stops those cravings and curbs the person from using in a destructive way. And I know that we've spoken about this before. It's particularly good for binge drinking. Other things that can help with non-problematic drinking is charting, moderation management, tracking and journaling, and being very intentional with the situations in which somebody is drinking if they are choosing to drink. Okay. And again, that's kind of problematic, especially with the 12-step community and centers that treat alcohol as, there is no option, you'd have to be abstinent. Okay. So, in looking a little bit closer at this, a slip is neither catastrophic nor regressive. It gives us information. It's temporary, and it doesn't have to be a horrible thing. If it's shamed or defined as a disaster or something horrible, then that might lead a person to a full-blown relapse. Okay? And it usually happens before a full relapse. But if the person can access support and do some cognitive work around it, some of the other techniques that we're going to talk about in this chapter, then it doesn't have to lead to a relapse and can actually really be part of success. So in this chapter, we're looking at several of the different theories that we've talked about before, about how these theories look at relapse prevention. Okay. The disease model, and we're on page 164, this accepts the basic assumptions that alcohol and drug-dependent individuals have virtually irresistible physical cravings for their chosen substance and that they experience a lost control over its use. The disease of alcoholism or drug dependence is seen as progressive and irreversible. Okay. Your authors go on to say that the shortcomings of this model for relapse prevention lie in its potential for a dichotomous view of the disorder and the problem of relapse. This view, which characterizes the thinking of some adherents of the disease concept, defines the client as either abstinent or relapsed. Okay. All right. And they go on to talk about that a slip leads directly to relapse, that first it's one drink and then it's 2 drinks and then it's a whole bottle. Okay. But this can create a double bind for a person. You must be abstinent to be well, and you have a chronically relapsing disease, which can be very confusing to a person. Well, okay, I'm going to relapse, but then I'm not abstinent, and then what do I do? Okay. So there are some concerns there. One of the seminal authors of relapse prevention is Gorski, and he's written several books about this. And he blends different types of theories into his relapse work. He believes that physiological dysfunctions place the addict at a risk for relapse, but also looks at the developmental role of recovery. So first, clients transition and seek treatment. Then they go through stabilization from acute withdrawal, early recovery, where they learn how to live without the drug. Then there's middle recovery, where they attempt balanced lifestyles. Late recovery, where they address the long-term psychological and family issues. And maintenance, which involve a permanent state of attention to the possibility of relapse. So you can see that Gorski's model really reflects the stages of change. Okay. And it's very much an educational model. Clients receive training in the developmental model of recovery, the general warning signs of relapse, and the skills they need for long-term maintenance. The model that Gorski espouses states that chemical addiction is a primary disease or disorder resulting in the abuse of an addiction to mood-altering chemicals. This model incorporates the roles of brain dysfunction, personality disorganization, social dysfunction, and family of origin problems to the problems of recovery and relapse. So Gorski acknowledges that it's not just as cut and dry as a disease model, and looks at all of those different things, the biological, physiological, and behavioral. Okay. He goes on to say that the symptoms are conceptualized as being most severe during the first 6 to 18 months of sobriety, but there is thought to be a lifelong tendency of these symptoms to return during times of physical or psychosocial stress. And that leads us to the discussion of paused or post-acute withdrawal syndrome. You have several resources in your Moodle module this week about that so that you can look at different articles that are going to say, is this real, is it not real, and then what does it look like with different substances. Okay. Relapse is the process of becoming dysfunctional in sobriety because of sobriety-based symptoms that lead to renewed alcohol or other drug use, physical or emotional collapse, or suicide. The relapse process is marked by predictable and identifiable warning signs that begin long before alcohol and other drug use or collapse occurs. So post-acute withdrawal syndrome is a theory that clients might feel like they are in withdrawal from drugs months and even years after they've used them. And you can predict this based off of what's going on in the person's life. And there are things that are characterized by feeling fatigued, getting irritable at people, maybe mild flu symptoms, just kind of feeling stuck and bogged down in life. If we know that these periods of time are coming up because we can predict them and even mark them on the calendar, that's when we recommend to clients that they can shore up their self-care, make sure that they're eating, make sure that they're sleeping well, make sure that they're exercising, and use it as okay, you're going to need a little extra TLC during these times. Okay. So the next theory we're going to look at are the learning theories. And this really looks at reinforcement theory. Social learning theorists think that substance use and abuse are a result of a certain history of learning in which the behavior of drinking alcohol or using drugs has been increased in frequency, duration, and intensity for the psychological benefits that it affords. Okay. And there are different learning theories within it. So in summation, we're looking at abusers increase substance use over time because of the psychological benefits. They're initially thought to be tension reducing and then reinforcing. However, it also deals with the incongruity that people engage in these excessive uses even though it brings on negative consequences. They say social punishment in the forms of job loss, social ostracism, emotional upset, and psychological and physical deterioration. Okay. And yet another social learning perspective suggests that excessive substance use is initiated by environmental stressors and is maintained by the hypothesized depressant and anesthetic effects of alcohol and other drugs on the central nervous system. Okay. And to do this, they say that avoiding alcohol or drug use is another type of reinforcement. Avoiding the withdrawal symptoms is itself a reinforcement of drug and alcohol use and thus becomes a secondary maintaining mechanism for excessive consumption. And I think that we see that particularly with opioid and IV heroin users. Okay. Moving on to the social learning model, where substance abuse is the result of a combination of factors. So it's building off of the learning theory, which is saying that we learn how to cope and we're reinforced. And now building on that, there's a lot of different factors here. Okay. All right. Some of these factors include cognitive, emotional, situational, social, and physiological variables. This approach is proactive because it allows us to pinpoint the cues and high-risk situations that may lead to a slip or relapse in our clients. In this regard, relapse prevention is possible, and relapse as an ultimate outcome is not inevitable. Substance abusing clients are given skills training and other interventions that allow them to function normally in an environment that is ordinarily very hostile to the recovery substance abuser. So here we have skills, we have an idea and a theory about why people are using, that it's complicated, and giving people skills to apply for when things get overwhelming. Now, the medical model considers relapse to be an all or nothing endeavor in which any use of a substance following abstinence is a relapse. So that's the disease model. In addition, relapse is viewed as a major symptom of the disease of chemical dependency, and clients are typically urged to exert their will to prevent a relapse. You'll hear that a lot, a will to prevent the relapse. The social learning perspective looks at a return to substance use as a learning experience that can be successfully used to bolster gains previously made in treatment. So instead of going back to ground zero, what did this learn? What worked for you the last time you became sober? What didn't work this time? How do we need to make adjustments? Okay. It's a rich learning experience that gives us information so that we can be successful the next time. Okay. And finally, we have the biopsychosocial model, which is different from Gorski's model, although his was also a combination. But it views addiction as a complex, progressive behavior pattern with biological, psychological, sociological, and behavioral components. We're looking at multiple systems and how they interact in the development of addictive behaviors and in their treatment. All right, so we need to look at all of those different risks: biological, psychological, and social systems. Right. The biological risks that can place individuals at risk are neurological impairments, cravings from cue reactivity, and biochemical deficiencies, also perhaps being vulnerability, genetic vulnerability. Psychological risks could be expectancies, shame and guilt, and deficiencies in coping skills. Social factors are pretty much everything else, negative or really positive life events, socioeconomic status, employment, stability of residence, and family issues. The biopsychosocial approach suggests that individual risk should be assessed through measurement and analysis of historical, biological, psychological, and social factors. Okay, so a little bit of everything. Because expectancy concerning the effects of this substance is seen as a risk factor, the model calls for cognitive interventions that addresses clients' beliefs about the positive and negative outcomes of drug use. It also pays attention to building psychosocial skills, including problem solving, cognitive coping, social skills, and stress management. And one of the things that you might hear is something that's used for anger management and PTSD. It's HALTs. Being hungry, if you experience hunger, anger, loneliness, tired states, and sickness, where relapse can be increased. And so acknowledging that a person's more vulnerable to relapse during those periods of time and applying the skills. Okay. All right. And what we need to do is to look at mindfulness and how a person can cultivate mindfulness, just like a skill or a muscle, so that they can be very active in their relapse prevention. Okay. So, what are some of the things or determinants that lead to relapse? High-risk situations, including any situation that threatens a client's sense of control. That could be a variety of things. So walking into a room where your old friends are using, stressful situations, negative emotional states, feeling anger, anxiety, frustration, depression, and boredom, interpersonal conflicts. Right? We have the absence violation effect, in which a traumatic situation builds into a relapse, or in which clients treat themselves for good behavior with their previous addiction. So, I did so long, I deserve a drink, or what's wrong with celebrating abstinence with a drink? Okay. So, the first part is where maybe somebody uses to cope with something and then they feel so guilty that they continue to drink. The guilt, shame, embarrassment, and dissonance leads to further psychological discomfort and then to a full-blown relapse. Okay. Cognitive risk factors include a person's way that they think about themselves. Okay? Shame, guilt, labeling. Normal life problems do occur. A client might not be prepared to respond effectively and tunnel back into a full-blown relapse. So what might be something that you and I could handle every day, somebody else might not be able to handle that. So for example, in a documentary about the Insight in Vancouver, there's an instance of a woman that has been sober for 3 years, and she just moved to the Vancouver area, and she's trying to find a pharmacy to fill her prescription, which for you or I might not be a very difficult thing, and she had a case manager to help her, but she didn't do it. And then she said, well, I had to use heroin because I couldn't refill my prescription. She had weeks to find a pharmacy, and there were pharmacies in the neighborhood. And so she wasn't able to handle that everyday situation, which led to a full-blown heroin relapse, as an example. And then we have lifestyle risk factors. which is people, places, and things, hanging out with people that are doing the same substances. There's a saying in 12 step that if you hang around the barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. And so you can apply that to substance use. There are a lot of great 12 step sayings like that. Nothing changes if nothing changes. It works if you work it, etc. Okay. I'm sure that you could look at other lifestyle risk factors as well. A very common one is bartenders who are sober working in bars, and people saying, well, I'm going to test myself to see how strong I am, my will. And there are some people that are able to do that successfully, and then there are people that are unable to do that. And we also see lifestyle identification with different professions. So a lot of people in the restaurant and service industries have alcohol issues and other drugs as well. Writers seem to have issues with alcohol. Right. So sometimes people do feel that they want to change careers because of that. But we're looking at the relapse chain, and this starts on page 173. So relapse doesn't usually just occur. It's like, oh, okay, I'm sober, and no, I'm not. That doesn't really happen. There's a process for it. So the first is a buildup or onset of stress. This could be positive stress, like planning a wedding or graduating school or getting a new job, or it could be negative stress. And then this can be clouded by overly negative or positive thoughts, moods, and feelings, including confusion, bewilderment, irritability, depression, elation, or complete numbness. So looking what's happening here, dichotomies, all right? We're not really seeing this when people are living in the middle. We're seeing this when there are huge swings, positive or negative, in either direction. Number 3, the client might overreact or does not act to stress, leading to an escalation. So maybe they just completely check out or numb out, or they overreact. And then we have denial here. The patient denies that the problem is serious or even exists. They might rationalize and say, well, it's not like last time. And they're not using their existing support system or other tools of recovery. Then we have the original problem escalates. Okay. Maybe even seeping up and bubbling, and because of that, new problems are created as the original problem is ignored. Okay. Number 6, the patient perceives the situation as anything beyond the point of no return and feels incapable of doing anything about it. So again, we have extremes here. Like, okay, well, I can't go back now, so I'm just going to go down the rabbit hole type thing. Number 7, the patient increasingly finds himself or herself in a high-risk situation or engaging in other subtle or not so subtle acts of self-sabotage, not returning phone calls, missing appointments, not reaching goals, etc. 8, stress further increases as the patient's life continues to skid out of control while he or she becomes increasingly isolated and alienated from his or her support system. Frustration, despair, embarrassment, hopelessness, and self-pity sit in and trigger obsessive thoughts about using. Okay. So now we're really, really close to relapse. And then irresistible cravings and urges lead the patient to obtain and use, and then the chain is complete. So you can see that it's a continuous buildup over time. It can be stopped in its tracks with mindfulness and awareness and accountability. All right, so how do we prevent relapse? We spend a lot of time looking at what relapse is and how the different theories look at it. And you're going to see some similarities. It's honesty, mindfulness, openness, communication, self-monitoring. This can look like journaling, tracking symptoms. There are some fantastic cell phone apps nowadays that can help you track your moods and your behaviors and what you eat and all of that. Direct observation is when clients are presented with a comprehensive list of situations and asked to rate them to the degree of temptation. So this would be, you're at, your drug of choice was alcohol, and you're at a tailgate party. On a scale from 1 to 10, how triggered do you feel? Okay. And then the counselor might follow up with, what would you do if you found yourself at a wedding reception where everyone was drinking? And then you can practice refusal skills and make a plan around that. And it gives the person greater awareness of what their individual triggers are. And everybody's are different. Creating coping skills goes with learning new skills, okay? And stress management techniques fall into there. So, for example, taking one thing at a time, working tension off physically, learning not to be a perfectionist, using humor, seeking outside help when needed, allowing for time alone, adopting hobbies and activities that don't involve substance use, striving for moderation as opposed to rigidity in thought and action, sleeping and eating correctly, and balancing the cost and benefits of life. So again, we're striving for balance. We often see addiction and relapse in terms of polarities, and all or nothing thinking is a big part of that. Okay. A decision matrix is basically a pro or con list that your book talks about. It can be a form or it could just be a list, where you could say, well, if I use the again, what are the pros? What are the cons? And actually looking at it concretely. Behavioral contracting is another technique which is similar to that. It should be simple, non-judgmental, and non-punitive, and it can include a statement recognizing that a slip is not a failure and emphasizing. So it can be a contract, or like, okay, if I feel a craving, I'm going to call this person. Here's a list of things that I can do if I feel triggered to use. And it's actually a step-by-step thing that a person can look at. And it starts from, the least severe to the most severe. And there can be phone numbers on there as well. There can be activities and action steps to take, like stop, looking and listening to what's happening, keeping calm, renewing their commitment to behavior change, review the situation, make an immediate plan for recovery, and ask for help. Okay. All right. Identifying and avoiding high-risk situations, again, can be in a list format, something that you can brainstorm. It works really well with group counseling. We often make a big list on the whiteboard and have everybody chip in, like, what are your high-risk situations? The holidays tend to be a big period of relapse, especially grief and loss. If somebody has lost a family member and they're not going to be able to celebrate with them physically, or if the family is using, that can be challenging as well. And then we have something called cognitive restructuring, which is mentioned in several chapters in the book. And basically, it's allowing a person to rethink what is happening to them and practicing positive mental attitude and reframing. Very similar and close to some of the cognitive behavioral therapy exercises that we use. And again, it can be used in person or a one-on-one or within group counseling. Okay. Creating a lifestyle balance. Again, you're going to be seeing all these themes here. It's not uncommon for somebody who gives up drugs and alcohol to become addicted to something else, like overworking, workaholism, or over-exercising, or becoming a helicopter parent, or a variety of different things. And so what we want are people that are all or nothing, habitually all or nothing, is to strive to create a balance. Okay. And we have to be careful about substituting indulgences there. They should be adaptive rather than maladaptive, and we can often see things shift that line. So we talk about where is the line between helpful and hurtful. But it could be something like going on a vacation, seeing a movie, getting a massage, reading, journaling, going to bed early. And this is another really great activity that you can do in a group situation to brainstorm and get ideas for everybody. Okay. And then we want to avoid urges through labeling and detachment. It's controversial when you go to a group, a 12-step, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an addict or an alcoholic. Is that helpful or harmful? And there's thoughts on either way. One, it takes the isolation out of it, and everybody's there for the same reason, which is good. Two, sometimes people feel like, well, is that all I am? You're telling me that I have this disease, and you're telling me that I'm going to relapse, and you're telling me that I'm going to have a hard time. Does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? So there's potential either way right there. And so then that kind of goes with the cognitive restructuring. So you could say, I'm experiencing a conditioned response that manifests itself as craving, rather as saying, I'm an addict and I'm going to use. Okay, I hope this was helpful. There's some good resources at the end of this chapter. Um, Brainstorming relapse prevention is a great group activity and can be a lot of fun. And one of the things that I would do in counseling is we would come up with a list, and then each person had to come up with 5 things from that list that they could do within the next couple of weeks, and then we would talk about it as homework. So everything that we do, it's not theoretical. We want our clients to apply it and try it out and see what works. Thank you for listening.